Physician and former President Donald Trump's White House coronavirus response coordinator, Dr. Deborah Birx, said she knew from the start of the pandemic that vaccines were not going to protect against infection. Take a listen.
I knew these vaccines were not going to protect against infection, and I think we overplayed the vaccines, and it made people then worry that it's not going to protect against severe disease and hospitalization. It will, but let's be very clear. 50% of the people who died from the Omicron surge were older.
Although I guess if 50% were old, the other 50% were the opposite then, right?
Right. So, I mean, I don't know if she meant that it wasn't going to protect as much as they claimed, or like absolutely in the way that some other vaccines that we're familiar with, are an absolute protection against getting certain kinds of diseases like, smallpox or whatever, these kinds of things that we've eradicated. But certainly, the point is that there was an overstatement of what exactly these vaccines were going to do.
Very much. What is she talking about? Where was she then? They should have said that. I guess maybe she resigned or she retired. I think for violating a social distancing thing, that she still had a family gathering or something of that nature. That is what it was. So maybe she was out of the picture then when the vaccines were coming out, and everybody like, yeah, get the vaccine. That's the end of COVID if you get the vaccine. But why she wouldn't have set expectations lower throughout during her time there just makes no sense.
I mean, I'm trying to reflect back because there was almost immediately this sense that Americans were not going to be compliant and get the vaccine. Even when Trump was still president, even when it was very early days and there was a lot of fear and concern, there seemed to be this kind of baked-in expectation that you couldn't scare Americans away from the vaccine, that you had to do things like tell them it was going to end the lockdowns, end the virus, end transmission, that it was all going to be over in a short period of time. And immediately, I remember there were these conversations about compliance rates. I mean, obviously the vaccine didn't come out until Biden was president, but about what percent of people they were going to need to get it for it to be able to work, and how it wasn't going to be enough with 75 or 90%. We had to get to herd immunity.
But that all ended up being wrong. There's no level at which it's enough because it does not prevent infection.
But the choice is so odd because it did feel preemptive in some ways. And I don't know. I have to look at how things went down in other countries.
Look, it is true that the vaccines held up very well against transmission of the original strain, and then it was a combination of things that eventually the protection does wane somewhat, and then Delta evaded the protection against transmission, and Omicron really invaded it, and then that was just kind of the end of the game. So you have to just make the argument that you should get it because it prevents. It helps with severe hospitalization.
Which is good enough
and death.
For me.
Sure.
And I think would have been probably good enough for a lot of people.
Well, and it's a good enough argument for older Americans, especially immunocompromised Americans. But they were also promising it, but everybody needs to get it because that way you won't give it to someone else.
Right.
And in exchange, no more masks for you, no more social distancing. You can go back to work. You can have birthday parties again. And then they said, well, just kidding. Never mind. Don't keep doing all of the following our guidelines, but we are glad you got it. Well, and it's still going to spread infection. Well,
let me ask you this, Robby. Would it have made more sense to you, and would you have preferred a world where they didn't overstate the efficacy of vaccines? They were very clear that it's about you and protecting yourself from the worst outcomes if you do get the virus, but also couple that with advice that we are going to, in fact, have to wear masks as the first line of defense for longer. I'm not going to lie to you about there being some into it, but honestly, if you don't want to get the vaccine, get the virus, you can't rely on vaccines. You're just going to have to mask up and social distance.
Well, but then you get into the issue, and Dr. Fauci himself conceded this on this show yesterday when we interviewed him, that the cloth masks, the kind of masks that were required for most people throughout most of the pandemic, because virtually nowhere, maybe some college campuses, maybe some environments have required the N95 and KN95 masks, but 98% of mask requirements have been of just any variety of masks, cloth masks, or maybe the ones with filters, whatever. They said no to those, but standard cloth masks have been the ones recommended. And Fauci himself said yesterday that's not doing any good.
Yeah,
that's not doing any good. So then what? If they're annoying and they're not doing any good,
for sure. But Robby, that's
why
cloth masks, and there are many people who have not follow the CDC's recommendation and follow their own common sense or what the medical professionals in their lives have advocated for and have been using KN95s. Ironically, when we had mask mandates, I was more inclined to use the flimsy little surgical masks because I was doing it because someone told me to. You know, I gotta get an Uber, I just gotta have a mask on me at all times, and I would go through them more quickly. So I would use the worst, least effective masks. After the mandates were over and it was just me looking out for myself and my personal responsibility, I exclusively only used KN95s, not just before where I would use them when I was in close proximity with someone for a long time, like at the nail salon. And I wonder if there's similar incentives that exist more broadly, where if someone's telling you to do it and you also don't trust the source, you're gonna kind of lowball it. You're gonna kind of, you know.
Just given how much previous guidance on masks so many times has turned out to be wrong. I want to wait for more information. I'm not like asserting this. We don't have the facts yet. Dr. Fauci said again in the interview on this program that he thinks there is evidence that these masks are working to limit the spread in some sense. How much? Is it a lot? Is it a little bit? It would not shock me if we learn in the future that they're not doing all that much, given how contagious these strains are, in which case...
And there are other things too, right? I remember a time when there was an active conversation about ventilators and getting schools better ventilated and getting more, local little HVAC machines in office places and stuff. And at the time, in the early days, it was, well, how are we gonna ramp all that up? There's supply chain issues. It'll take time. Right now, we just got to social distance and mask. But 2 years plus into this, it feels a little ridiculous that we don't have more of a robust conversation about how there could be kind of institutional fixes to some of this stuff, instead of doing the things where you're expecting kindergartners to keep the masks on their face. Why isn't there more investment in the school infrastructure to make them at least as safe as an airplane is while it's in the air? Do you know what I mean?
We need more investment, clearly, in a vaccine that is actually going to lower transmission. That would be nice. And maybe one relying not on mRNA technology, just simply because I know a lot of people are skeptical and hesitant about those specific vaccines. So something that they were not as skeptical of, that had a better track record, might be something you could get more people to take, or different people to take.
Yeah, I mean, I should hope that they're trying. The scientists haven't said, we did okay, let's hang up our coats.
The FDA couldn't, we're going to talk about monkeypox later, but the FDA couldn't be bothered to inspect the monkeypox vaccine factory on a tighter schedule as this epidemic is beginning to rage among certain subsets of our population.
Yeah.
A nasty, horrible disease. We are going to talk about it a little bit later.
We are having
I have no faith.
Redux on the monkeypox.
No faith that our people are prioritizing the right stuff.
Well, Senator Rand Paul has said that Republicans will investigate Dr. Fauci should they regain control of Congress in November. Dr. Fauci responding to that for the first time today. Let's watch.
This, which is politics, I know one of your least favorite subjects here. Senator Rand Paul, a Republican, and some Republicans are talking about what they might do if they retake the House or the Senate in the fall. Senator Rand Paul says of the Republicans, if they retake the House, one way or another, if we are in the majority, we will subpoena your records, and he will testify in the Senate under oath. Your reaction to Rand Paul and others saying they're going to investigate you if they take power?
Well, there's no reason to do that, but if they want to, go ahead. My records are an open book. They are talking about things that are really bizarre, John, like crimes against democracy by shutting down the government. All I have ever done, and go back and look at everything I've ever done, was to recommend common sense, good, CDC-recommended public health policies that have saved millions of lives. If you want to investigate for me for that, go ahead.
And when Bach and I talked to him yesterday, he took that line that, look, what I say is just recommendations. So if you have problems with these policies, take it up with your local officials, your state governments, et cetera, which, fair enough, because they were just recommendations. But what was frustrating during the pandemic was how the CDC's word did just become law in blue municipalities, that we were just going to do what the CDC said. But that's what's interesting.
And are Republicans kind of falsely conflating the CDC with Fauci as an individual? Do they want to investigate the CDC, or are they trying to use Fauci as a stalking horse because there's some political power in doing so. And, to be fair, Democrats did put Fauci up front and center, and frankly, so did Trump. Everyone put Fauci up front and center and kind of exploited him as a positive figure who people had trusted in the early days, and now everybody's kind of backing away from that. So maybe it is fair to have perceived Fauci as being the leader on what the CDC was actually doing when the critique is really of the CDC. But it does feel to me like this is if this happens, will be another show trial, like worse, like a small version of the 1-6 fiasco.
I mostly agree with that. The things he recommended were policy choices that I disagree with, but they were policy choices. With the exception of the funding of gain-of-function research, that clearly does need more investigation. And that, again, we don't know, we need to know more stuff, but the potential that the kind of research of which he is the foremost public advocate and has defended funding, and then he quibbled when we talked to him about it with, what does gain of function even mean? He tries to do this definitional dance, whatever, manipulating the virus to make it more lethal or more contagious, harder to confront, harder to deal with. We don't know if that caused this pandemic. It seems certain that it could in the future cause a pandemic just like this. So that would rise, in my view, to the level, or could potentially rise to the level of not just a bad policy choice, but something criminal. So that I want more, obviously not in a show trial kind of, the Senate is the worst people to do this kind of thing. But.
I mean, we did learn at one point that the government knew the virus was airborne long before they were telling us that it was airborne. And I think those kinds of revelations go a long way toward liability and people's trust in government. And I do think it's important to get that stuff out. So to the extent that we, frankly, could find out, I don't know if it's by investigating Fauci or versus the CDC, but if we could find out that, for example, they had more information about when masks were useful, when the virus was airborne, when what the virus's effect on transmission was actually going to be while they were telling us that was why people should get vaccinated. I do think that having that stuff come out is important to reestablishing public trust.
And also I don't know that there's been sufficient accountability for the CDC's mistakes in terms of testing, which were just catastrophic. And I'm not saying that those are on Fauci specifically, but someone's head should have rolled there should have been massive sanction for that, because it was such a mistake.
Yes.
And a mistake that we, again, seem like we're making similar ones with monkeypox, but we'll talk about that later. More Rising right after this.